Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. We've made it through another week. I'm excited for the weekend. Hopefully all of you are as well. If you are tuning in live here on Behance today, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Tatiana and Umacorn, Anita, Cody, Laura, Thiago, Jack, Antonio. Great to see you. Hey, Wade. Great to see all of you. New faces, old faces, regular faces. Masterclass number 51. We've almost completed an entire year of Adobe XD Masterclasses. Amazing. And many of you have been here since Masterclass number 1. While we're at it, I would love suggestions for next week. Next week's going to be Masterclass 52, a whole year of Masterclasses. Shoot me a tweet, and I'd love to see some suggestions on what we should cover. So, speaking of Twitter, I'm going to hop over to my screen for a second, and you may have seen me posting about this Messenger app design I've been working on, and we started the process last week of putting it together. And this is kind of what it's going to look like in the end. And after this masterclass, over the next probably few weeks, we're going to be building this out on YouTube as well as standalone videos. So if you don't prefer live streams or you want to watch a more condensed version, you'll be able to do so at some point. I don't know when, but I'm working on it. All right, is that a green screen background or no? So it is. There's a green screen background behind me. So if you're probably referring to that right there. It's an actual picture of my actual office, but because when I switch over to my screen, I don't want anything behind me. I do have a green screen behind me, so it's a green screen of my actual office. Confusing, right? Yeah. All right, so I also have a dark mode version of this design. Let me know in the chat on Behance whether you prefer the light mode or the dark mode. I don't know. I like both, but each has fun personality traits to it. All right, so we're gonna hop over to Adobe XD and we're gonna get going. So this is kind of where we left off last week. We started off the process designing our user list on the left, and we used features like stacks. I also showed you how repeat grids can be used for something like this as well, but ultimately we use stacks so that we can dive in here and just rearrange our elements as we need them, right? Now, one other thing we might want to do is, I kind of touched on it last week, but we didn't do it properly, is have some sort of a hover effect over top of this. Now, because everything is inside of a stack, right? If you were to add a hover effect on this one, and if it were to kind of peek out into the card above it, the layering is not going to work very well. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some tweaks to that. So we're going to redo some of these hover effects, and then we're going to move on to the messages list on the left, and then we're going to start building out this big area on the right. We have a lot of space over there, so we can definitely add in some cool stuff. So very quickly, in either of these, we're going to dive in, and you can do this in a separate stack or in the same stack, completely up to you. And you know what we might want to do is actually do this in a separate stack. So I'm going to go outside of this. I'm actually just going to make my life a little bit easier. I'm going to grab the layer right here. I'm going to paste it. And just to show you, let's go ahead and unlink this graphic. So we have this layer on top, and we're going to use this as our hover effect. I love separating my hover effects from the actual content. It just makes it a little bit easier, gives you more flexibility. So I'm going to go ahead and make some very small tweaks. Maybe I'll set the border on the inside, make it nice and thin. And then we do not need the fill because, there's not going to be anything to fill, right? So we want to be able to see the image in the background. And this will also be used as our hotspot so that when our mouse hovers over it, it knows exactly what to look for. Now, over top of this, we may want a little call out to let us know who this user is. So I'm going to start with my rectangle. I'm going to draw one out. Like that. Maybe I'll round out the corners ever so slightly. Let's try 4 pixels. And then I might want a little bit of an arrow pointing down to the user. So I'm going to grab the polygon tool, shortcut key Y. Thank you, Cody, for posting the link to toy faces in there. I'm going to flip it over, and I'll also round out the corners ever so slightly of this shape as well, right? So now that we have our 2 shapes in place, we want to be able to combine them into one. And that obviously comes with many benefits, but One of the benefits is we'll be able to update the styling of both of these shapes at once. So I'm going to select both of these, holding down my Shift key, right? And then at the very top right-hand corner, I can go ahead and add them to a Boolean object. You also have subtract, exclude, all that fun stuff. But right now we are focusing on add. There we go. So we have a nice little callout. Of course, we can adjust. It's all non-destructive, so you can dive in here and adjust as needed. Now I'm thinking, because a lot of the elements around this are very light, I might want to go a little bit darker with this particular shape. So let's go ahead and try a background blur, because we love background blurs here, right? And maybe I'll set the brightness at 0 for now. I am going to change the fill to black. Now you're noticing nothing's really happening right now. And that's because the background blur has complete control over the shape at the moment. If you do want to bring back some of the color of your fill, down here at the bottom, you're going to increase your effect opacity. So I'm going to bring that on up. And now we have a nice little background blur. And of course, if you do move it over, you're going to see it's interacting nicely with the colors behind it. Now I have it very subtle, so you're not seeing too much. And I'm going to go ahead and change the border to white and just drop the opacity a little bit, right? So if we take a look, it's a nice subtle effect. All right, and then finally in the inside, I'm just going to type out the user's name. In this case, that is me. Let's make it quite a bit smaller. I can also grab the handle on the bottom, drag that down. Maybe I'll bump the weight up to, let's try bold. Take a quick peek. It's not too bad. Maybe I'll bump it up a little bit more. That's a little bit better. All right, so we have all the elements in place for our hover effect. So what we want to do now is take all these elements, including the name, and also I'm just going to call this callout. We're going to take also the hotspot that we created, take all three of these and pop them into a single component. Now this can be done inside of your document assets right here, or it can be done in the properties inspector over to the right. Now I'm going to do it over to the right only because we also want to create a hover effect. Now, our default state, we don't want the callout to be displayed initially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into this component. I'm going to name this callout, and I'm simply going to hide the name and also the callout shape, just like that. And I could go ahead and leave this border if I want to, right? It's also going to help us identify, or XD identify the hotspot, so it knows when to display that hover. So our default state is now complete. I'm going to hit that plus button one more time and create a hover state. Now, hover states are wired up by default, as indicated by the lightning icon over to the right, but we are going to switch the interaction just a little bit in a moment. There we go. And with that done, I'm going to dive in here and I'm simply going to unhide the two shapes that we hid originally, right? So we now have our default state and we have our hover state. So if I'm on the default state, I can very easily hover, and there it is, right? Now you're noticing there's a little bit of a fade, and that's because auto animate is the default action for hover states, but there's really nothing to animate. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop into prototype mode, and I'm simply going to switch the action from auto animate to transition and animation to none. And that'll allow us to very easily and seamlessly hover over all of the users once we have those in place, right? So what I'm going to do now is we want a few more. Now, of course, we can add these directly into the individual users groups, but we can also use a stack or a repeat grid as well. So I'm going to go to the hover state, and let's go ahead and pop these into a group. We're going to call this hovers. And I should mention that, you know, there are many ways of doing this. Some people like adding the hover effects directly into the groups. Some people don't. Some people like to keep them separately. Completely up to you, and also your developers as well. So I'm going to turn a stack on, make sure it's vertical. We did all this last week as well. And now I can dive in, duplicate, 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 until I have enough for all of my users, right? And maybe also the add button at the bottom. Now, what you're noticing is because we haven't defined the padding yet, the overlap is a little bit strange. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key and adjust this until it all lines up. And look at that, it lined up perfectly. Now this one didn't line up perfectly because that add button is a little bit smaller. So we'll get to that in a second. Now, obviously, these are not all Howards. So I'm going to dive in to each of these and change this to, let's say, I'm going to grab some names from here. There's this Chris. And this one over here is, I need another name, Cody. And we've got another one over here. Let's see, who do we have in here? We have Ahmed. Did I spell that correctly? I think so. And then over here, Laura. Where'd my cursor go? I lost my cursor. There we go. And then finally, we got one more name. Let's see. Dun 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 dun. Umacorn. Perfect. All right, now this one down here is going to be add, but again, like I mentioned, because that add button's a little bit smaller, what we might want to do is just make it, well, actually we can just do this, right? Oh, this is the main component, so you don't want to do it there, right? Maybe I'll just make the add button bigger, just to match everything else. Should have done that at the beginning, right? Almost. And then adjust the spacing a little bit. That's a little bit better. It's not perfect. The add button is different than all these other ones, so maybe I'll just ignore that. Bye-bye. There we go. All right, so now if I press the play button at the top, whoops, wrong artboard. You're going to notice we can now hover over all of these users very easily. And because we switched the action to transition versus auto animate, we don't have to sit around and wait for that animation to complete. We can just hover just like that, right? Perfect. All right, so our users are looking pretty good. We've got our hover effects, we've got all the users. And now we're going to move on to talk a little bit more about the messages. And we started that process last week, and we built out these three, and we also used padding so that we can dive in here. And as we make changes, right, it's going to push everything below it down, which is amazing. Now, if you missed last week's show, what we can do is I'm going to duplicate this layer here. And you're going to notice over to the right, we have padding turned on. And when you turn on padding, it's going to look at the background layer, which is the layer at the very back. And then it's going to look at all the layers above it. And it's going to take a look at how much padding is around it and define it, right? So it defined it as 16, 16, 32, and 18. And of course, if you need to, you can also adjust the padding. And you're noticing, because I have the layer above it selected, it's adjusting perfectly, right? So I can dive in here and make some changes. And let's go ahead and hop over to my toy faces so we can get a new face in there. Bloop, just like that. And we'll give it another name, Maria. Currently watching the latest Adobe XD Masterclass, right? And again, you noticed that the padding around it, because we have padding turned on, it automatically resized that box. Now, I mentioned last week that once you start getting to the bottom of this section, you might run into some issues, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this message down here. I can rearrange because I have stacking enabled. Let's duplicate another one, pop that there, and we can very easily swap out some faces. And I'll just put Laura's name again. And we'll keep that one as that for now, right? So what you're going to notice down here is there's a little, I mean, it's not terrible, right? But there's a little bit of intersection right here, especially if this box in the background was a little bit skinnier, right? You're going to notice that we have a little bit of overlap, and we may not exactly want that. Now, this right here, it's not bad. It could work. But there are a few things you can do to make sure that that doesn't happen. The first thing is, and this is regardless of whether or not we'll want to, make sure that overlap, regardless of whether or not that overlap is happening, we'll want to enable a scroll group. So with this entire group of messages selected, over to the right within the Properties Inspector, we can enable a vertical scroll group. You can also do horizontal or scroll groups in both directions, right? And now you have these handles, one at the top and one at the bottom. And usually it snaps really nicely into place, but if not, you can always adjust it like that. And now if I press play at the top, we can scroll and see all of our messages just like that. Someone's asking, is this file available in the cloud so we can check it? It's not at the moment, but I'm hoping that once the set of videos come out, I'll be able to release this file. All right, so that is one way to do it. Now, another way is you can use a mask. So if I grab this background layer, I'm going to duplicate it, Command and Control D, and make sure it's at the top of this layer stack, right? So right now it's hiding everything. But what you want to do is inside the layers is you can select the layer that we just duplicated, which I'll call mask, and also all the layers below it. And then under the object menu, you can go mask with shape, and that'll take everything below it and mask it really nicely inside, right? So that way, if this shape was smaller or if this group of messages was moved over a little bit, you're not going to get that overlap. It's going to mask it really nicely in place, which is great. Now, what you noticed is because I had a shadow on that background layer, it also masked the shadow out. So in that case, you can just exclude that background layer, object, mask with shape. Now that shadow looks pretty good. And again, if I grab the scroll group, move it over, everything's masked really nicely, which is great. All right, so now what we're going to do, we're going to tackle this big area over to the right. And I'm thinking in this area, we might want the ability to search, we might want our profile, maybe a notification bell, that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is we have this white box selected, which I'm just going to call container. And I might want a little bit of a separator right here at the top. So Mayor is asking, does padding work on extended shapes like you created in the hover states? Does padding, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Does padding work on extended shapes? I'm not sure. Try to clarify and maybe give an example so I can take a look. Cornell's asking, any new XD update coming soon? Yes. So we have an update in May, June, I mean, basically every month. But Andrew Shorten did tweet that, the team has been working on some performance updates to make sure that XD is a bit more stable and it runs a bit faster. But now that those are kind of settled down a little bit, there's some updates coming, new features. I wish I can tell you what new features are coming, not just this month, but all the months ahead. I can't, unfortunately, but we have some really cool stuff coming. I cannot wait. So I'm going to grab the line tool and drag a line across here, just like that. Perfect. And I want this as a very subtle line, so I'm just going to simply drop the color a little bit. There we go. And then at the top left-hand corner of this section, we may want to kick it off with a search icon. Now, of course, you can make your own search icon, or if you're lazy, like I am sometimes, you can use a plugin, right? Or icon library. We're going to type out search. Actually, it's magnify. Magnify. There we go. I found it. And I'm going to grab this icon, pop it in there. Now, right now, this gray color is a little bit too light. So I'm going to just drop this. I don't want it to stand out too much. And maybe I'll add a little bit of blue in there just to add a touch of color. Make it smaller. And pop it into place. There we go. Do you think by teaching others you are more fast? Sometimes. I think sometimes I go too fast when I'm teaching, so my designs tend to be a little bit sloppier. But yeah, sometimes I definitely move a little bit quicker than usual. And I'll type out search. I'll go ahead and sample this color. And of course, if I did have these colors inside of my document assets, which is right over here, I can, just use them from there. I don't have that yet, but there we go. Now I do. All right. It's a little bit too small, so I'm going to bump this up. Let's try 18. I'm going to left align it, and we probably don't need bold for this section, but I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to, let's try book. Maybe I'll bump it up a little bit more, actually. And maybe let's try, instead of book, maybe medium. There we go. Stack is not working on messages. So if you missed last week's masterclass, definitely go back and watch that. That way, I do explain how to enable stacks on this section here. I'm not going to go through it again because I do want to get to some of the stuff on the right-hand side, but make sure that you have your stack enabled within the properties inspector, and then you should be able to rearrange like that. All right. So you added the rectangle and the triangle to create a different shape, and now you wrote, oh, yes, okay, so that's a good question. So what you're referring to is inside of these hover effects, you're asking if, okay. I made a mistake. I changed the main component to add and then it changed the rest. That was my bad. But anyways, what you're asking is if you type out, let's say Howard or a longer name, could this background resize? And the answer is absolutely. So what I'm going to do is let's find the main component. Actually, we can just do it on this one. No, let's find the main component. So it pushes it to all of them. So let's go ahead and edit main component. There it is. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to the default state just so that we can push it to everything. And what we want to do here is grab both of these elements, right? So the callout and the text layer. We don't want to include the border because we don't want that to change. So we're going to group these two elements and we'll call this callout. And what you're asking is if we can change this to, let's say, hello, right? Will that background change? Now, what we want to do is with this group selected, we're going to turn on padding, just like we did with some of the other objects we've been working on. And it's going to define that padding just like with the messages. And now if I go in here and type out, let's say, I'll type out your name, Mayor, right? You're going to notice it adjusted really nicely. However, what you also noticed is, right, you're going to notice that little call out at the bottom, that little polygon, it's squishing a little bit because it's all resizing at once. So in that case, what you want to do, if you have elements that you want to remain the same size, you're going to go ahead and select that little polygon. And then inside of the properties inspector, just make sure that you have fixed width and possibly optionally fixed height turned on. I like turning them both on if I'm not concerned about that adjusting at all. And now you're going to notice that polygon stays in place really nicely, but the background adjusted, which is exactly what we want, right? And I can hide this, and then we have our hover state as well. So hopefully that answered your question. You know, I did edit the main component so it pushed things away. I'm actually going to just undo this for now. There we go. All right, so hopefully that answered your question. Let's see, don't you think that by making XD's options, for example, making components, it really not letting us focus on the main design? I'm not sure what that means either. Definitely clarify, but yeah, let me know. All right, so we've got our search field. Not a very nice search field, but it's simple, right? It'll do. Now over to the right-hand side, we may want some additional icons, maybe a notification bell, a messages icon, and our user. So I'm going to grab the ellipse tool, draw one out. And for this one, I do want to grab my toy face, pop that in there, just like that. And maybe I'll also want to indicate whether or not I am online or offline. And maybe this will be an area where you'll be able to click on it and, you know, choose a different status. So I'm going to grab the ellipse tool, draw one out. And then I might want to add a border, let's say a white border, and then change this. Maybe I'm online at the moment, so I'll just change this to a nice green, right? Take a quick peek, and that's pretty good for the size. Now, right beside, we may want my name. Let's change this to a darker color. There we go. Again, take a quick peek just to make sure that everything's looking pretty good. I'm going to bump it up just a little bit. And then right below, I might just want to write out online. Now this one, I might just drop the weight to maybe book or medium, because it is secondary information, possibly medium. That could work. Perfect. And I'm going to grab all this information, pop it into a group, and just call this user. Did you make the toy face background? So I didn't make that background. It's an Adobe stock asset, but they did paste it behind my toy face just to give it a little bit more style. All right, now over to the right, we want some additional icons. And like I mentioned, we might want something like a chat icon or a message. Let's go ahead and grab this one over here. Paste that in there. It's a very large icon, so I'm going to make sure to shrink it down. And then maybe a bell for notifications. All right, I'm going to make sure it's the same size. Those smart guides are helping me out really nicely. Let's go ahead and change the color to match. And then for the notifications, we may also want to show what exactly it looks like when you get a notification. Now I already have this asset over here, which I can probably just steal. So I'm going to copy that, hop over here, paste it, and then change the color to more of a red. That looks pretty good. All right. Now, one more thing we might want to add. I'm going to group these and just call this Bell. I think those are a little bit too large, actually. Let me make sure that this is smaller. That's a bit better. So one more thing we might want to add are separators in between these various icons and also this user. Now, we don't want anything too drastic, so I'm going to grab the line tool, draw one out, and maybe I'll actually sample this gray that I'm using down here. Of course, again, if you have assets or your colors saved in your assets, which I would definitely recommend, you can just do that. There we go. Nice and subtle separators. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to grab all this information, group it, and just call this maybe right icons. And then I'm going to pop it into a stack. That way it's going to define it as a horizontal stack, which I can define, let's try 24 pixels in between. And if I did need to, I can always just grab these, shift them around, or adjust the spacing all at once, right? All right. Perfect. All right, can you recommend some courses from some of your classes? So I do have a new course on LinkedIn Learning, which is slowly rolling out. It's a weekly course, but Skillshare has some great stuff. YouTube has some great stuff. Our new Learn Hub. So if you go to the Adobe XD website, or if you go to letsxd.com, it'll redirect you. A lot of videos there. Danny Beaumont has a great series on if you're just getting started. I would definitely recommend that. And if anyone in the chat has some suggestions, definitely throw it in there. All right, so we have that top section looking decent. Not great, but it'll work, right? Top section. And then down here, we might want some additional information. This could be maybe a channel that's part of this Messenger app. You might be familiar with Slack, or any of these other services. And they have various channels you can go in to talk about something interesting. So with the text tool, let's say this is the Adobe XD Masterclass channel. And I'm going to make this nice and large. Is that too large? Maybe. I don't know. It probably is. So let's drop it a little bit. That's probably a bit better. All right, usually people save animated work, but how do they save animated work in XD? So you can record videos in XD. You can also export SVGs and things like that. Animation is not supported just yet, but definitely something the team is thinking about and possibly even working on. So stay tuned for that. All right, let's drop this to book, possibly. We don't want it too thin. If you go, let's say, extra light, it might be a little bit difficult to read. So you probably want to stay book. Maybe, light, possibly, could work. Might be a little bit too light, so I'll just keep it at book for now. And then right underneath, we might want some sub information. This is going to be a lot smaller. Let's try 32. A place to chat about upcoming XD classes. It's a little too large. Let's try 24. Oh, that's right. Cornell's mentioning the XD Daily Creative Challenges. If you are new to XD, behance.net/challenge/XD. Fantastic place to learn new skills. And also you can see the past challenges if you just scroll down. It's pretty good. All right. And then finally, over to the right, we might want to display how many members are inside of this channel. So what I'm going to do is refer to my toy faces again. So I'm going to draw out one toy face here, or one ellipse. And maybe I'll give it a little bit of a border so that, and you'll see why I'm going to give it a border in just a moment. It's a pretty good size. And then for this one, because we might want a few of these avatars going across, I'm going to pop it into a repeat grid right here at the top, and boop. There we go. And then I can drag out a few additional users like this. Now, of course, you're not going to display all the users that are part of this channel, but I'm going to overlap it just to display a few of them. Did you ever work in PC for XD? So I do. I do have a PC. I have one of those Surface laptops. So I use that from time to time, but I just prefer working on the Mac, mainly because a lot of the streaming software that I use is on the Mac, so I just, I stick with that, stick with what I know. But, PC works great too. So I have that in place. Now I'm going to select a few users. Let's just go for these generic faces and pop them directly in there. And then maybe underneath, we might just want to write out 243 members. I'm going to drop it in size. Let's try 18. Now this one, I do want to right align, so I'm going to switch it over to that. And I may even want to just drop the opacity a little bit because we don't want this to stand out too much. Something like that. It's not great, but it'll do. And I'm going to make sure that this is aligned with this information on the left. Perfect. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and select all this information here. Make sure that nothing else is selected. Don't want the background layer selected. Group and call this, let's say, channel info. Perfect. And then finally, duplicate that line so we have another separation, right? There we go. All right. So now right below this is where the actual messages are going to be displayed. And this is where we can start combining some of the features we've been thinking about, including stacks and padding and possibly component states and hover and all that fun stuff, right? So what we're going to do is right in this area here, we're going to start off with the first user. Now we've been using, rounded corners for some of these. This one over here, there isn't a lot of consistency. I would definitely recommend making sure things are consistent. But for this one, we are going to stick with slightly rounded corners. Let's try 16. Let's see, a lot of questions. Can you please recommend some plugins for XD? So let's hop over to the plugins panel. And there's a bunch that I've been using in my streams. So if you're looking for things like avatars, and you don't have toy faces, for example, UI faces is a good one. Where is UI faces? It's around here somewhere. Do I not have it installed? I can't find it. I may have deleted it by mistake, or I was working on, actually it's right here. I can't see today. So UI faces is a good one. You can, add in some images. So I can dive in here, right? And I can pull in some images from Unsplash. I can select specific photos if I wanted to. It's gonna load the photos. There we go. So I can go through and just select a few photos and then apply. There we go, right? So if you don't have access to stock images or your own photos, you can definitely use that. Maybe I'll keep that. It looks pretty good. Another one is Icons for Design. I'm a big fan of that plugin. You did see me earlier go into Nucleo, so I do have a lot of these icons purchased or were given to me. And if you don't, you can definitely use the Icons for Design plugin, search, and you can grab icons from there. They're all open source icons, so you can definitely use them in your projects. But I would just recommend, browsing some of the plugins. Blobular is a fun one if you want to create some blobs, because who doesn't love blobs, right? Oh, that's inside the repeat grid, but you can create blobs and stuff, right? There we go. Look at that. Blobs. Fun. All right. Let's go ahead and... Can we have a masterclass focused on dark mode? So yeah, probably. So if you did notice, I do have this one up here. And I do at some point, probably not next week because I want to mix it up a little bit, but I do want to revisit this and show you all how to convert a design from light mode to dark mode and some of the things you have to think about, because it's not just as easy as, grabbing the a shape and turning down the brightness or dropping it to black instead of white, right? Sometimes the text layers, you have to play around with the different weights. Sometimes you have to completely change the typefaces. You'll have to change borders. There's a lot you have to think about when it comes to dark mode versus light mode, right? There's a lot that goes into it. And of course, if you're working with style guides and design systems and things like that, then, those come into play as well. Hey, Tim, do people know Tim? Can I say the thing? The thing? Do people know yet? Let me know in the chat if people know. Then I can say the thing about the thing. Sorry. All right. So we have our first user here, and we're gonna stick with our toy faces for now. And we'll pop this in. We'll pop me in there. There we go. And then over to the right, we're gonna want some text. Howard Pinsky. That is me. There we go. And probably want this a little bit, yeah, probably a little bit larger. Tim's birthday. Happy birthday, Tim. But that's not the thing I was talking about. Does Tim know? Do people know about the other thing? I don't know anymore. You said yes. I'm assuming that's for the thing that possibly that's not your birthday. I don't know. I'll wait a little bit longer before I say anything. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this over, and over here I might want to display when this message was sent. So this one might be, 11:59. Whoa, 100. No, that's not how this works. 11:59 a.m. And I'm going to drop this in weight to maybe medium. Maybe I'll drop the color a little bit as well. There we go. Howard and I are planning a font masterclass, just Comic Sans and Papyrus. That could be interesting. That's also not the thing that I was referring to, but that could be interesting, right? All right, so what you're noticing now is I went in here and I removed part of my last name. And now I have to go through and move that over. Not very fun, right? So in this is another area. It's a very small area, but it's another area where something like stacks would really help the process. So I'm going to select both of these layers, group them, and I'll just call this user info. And I'm going to turn a stack on. And we have now two elements inside of the stack, right? And you can see that I can adjust the padding. But now, if I just go ahead and boop, just like that, it's going to automatically grab that layer on the right-hand side and shift it on over. Perfect. Maybe I'll drop this in size just a touch. All right. Yes, it has been public since April 1st. Okay, I haven't been watching streams or anything like that, so I'm not sure. So Tim, if any of you missed the news, has joined Adobe. He's working on the European team, I believe, on Adobe Live content. So congratulations, Tim. I can finally announce it publicly, but I guess it's been public for a while. I apologize, Tim. All right, so now down below this name, I might want to add in some text. Now for this one, in the past we have simply clicked to create point text, but we might want to click and drag to define a much larger area. So I'm going to drag one out just like this, and I might want to start typing something like the latest Adobe XD Masterclass is starting in just a few moments. Let's go ahead and make some changes. I am going to bump up the size a little bit. Medium looks pretty good, actually. Now I'm also noticing we have this massive area, right? And we have relatively small elements. So what we can do in this case is, we can maybe make this bigger, or we can play around with maybe the padding, move some of this stuff over a little bit. Or you can just make the artboard a little bit smaller too. You can do that, right? There we go. Now you can send me unsolicited texts at 3 a.m. I will not answer those, Tim. I'm sorry. All right. This is another area where we can probably use some padding as well. Just make sure to add padding on the entire thing, but we're gonna run with this. All right, is this too small? It might be too small. Maybe I'll bump this up a little bit. Maybe I'll bump all of this stuff up. 22, let's try 24. Just so we have nice legibility. Congrats on Leafs getting in the playoffs. Thank you. I'm excited to watch us probably lose in the first round again. Although, out of all the years in the past, of all the recent modern years, this is probably our best chance. Let's not talk about the year where we lost to Boston in Game 7, but yeah. All right, so we've got that looking pretty good. And now what we want to do is we want to add some additional users, some additional text messages and things like that. Can you say something like Cristiano Ronaldo? I think that's a soccer player. I have no idea what that is. I apologize. I'm not big into soccer, but so I don't know what that means. Sorry. So I'm going to grab this information. I'm going to group it and just call this message. And then with this one ready to go, what I want to do is place this message into a larger group called messages. And this is very similar to what we did with the section over here to the left with the list of messages. These are just the individual messages. And with this done, I can turn a stack on in the properties inspector, set it to vertical, and then boop, duplicate. So we have another one. Go Habs. Oh, Christine. Oh no. You didn't do so well last night, did you? When it was last night or the night before? Sing the night before. Yeah. All right. That looks, yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit more padding, maybe 32. Now, of course, if I keep duplicating this, we're gonna have a lot of messages going down the artboard, but let's go ahead and make some changes. So this might be, let's go for Christine J, and maybe she sent it at 12 o'clock p.m. Let's find a toy face, pop that in there. I don't know if that's what you look like, but we're gonna run with it. I'm so sad that my Habs got beat by Howard's Maple Leafs. It's been quite a season. There we go. I like to have fun with my hockey fans. Anita says, no Habs. Thank you, Anita. All right, so we have another message here. Now, maybe, this message sparked some controversy. Maybe people are not happy, or they are happy, I don't know. So maybe right below, we might want to display some replies. So I'm gonna dive into this group, and very similar to what we did up here. And what we can do actually is just grab this repeat grid. It's gonna be a little bit too large, but we can dive in here, place that. Actually, it's not too bad, the size. Maybe it's a little bit too large, right? So I'm gonna dive in. The great thing about repeat grids is that you can dive into one of them. Look at that, right? Now they're smaller. Wonderful. All right, now over here to the right, we might want to type out, let's say 9 replies. That looks okay. And maybe I'll just switch up these just to make it a little bit different. All right, Christine has not responded. I apologize, Christine. Perfect. Let's add one more toy face. Let's just make sure that everything is nicely spaced out. Perfect. All right, so we have that one in place, and now we may also want to display what it could look like when someone adds a photo, for example. So let's go ahead and grab my message up here. I'm gonna duplicate it, shift it on, oops, only want one of them. Shift that on down, and you're really starting to see how easy it is to, once you enable stacks and padding and all that fun stuff, how easy it is to really rearrange and start adding in content. Here's a preview of what we will be creating today. 12 o'clock p.m. There we go. And then right below here, we're going to add in an image. So I'm going to grab my rectangle, draw one out like that. Maybe I'll round out the corners just a little bit. How should I respond? Leafs suck. I'm sad now. All right, and then I'm gonna go into my Finder or Explorer on Windows. I'm gonna grab, let's say, this one over here. This is a version I did with a profile pane on the right-hand side, which maybe in a future masterclass we'll talk about, but I definitely will be discussing that and showing that off in a future video. Pop that in there. Although this one is missing the user list on the right, so I'll just grab this one, or the left. There we go. Perfect. Probably don't need a border on this. Now for this section here, because we have content extending down the artboard, right? So if I, let's say, duplicate this, let's add another toy face. Let's say this is Bob R. And this might be 12:01 p.m. That looks amazing. And then grab this one and drag it on down. It's that simple, right? So what I can do, because there's content extending all the way down there, is select this entire group of messages and simply, just like we did with the other list of messages, is I can enable a vertical scroll group, just like that. And then I can adjust this, and now I can scroll. Now what you're going to notice is because by default, there's no padding on the overall group, the message at the bottom stopped right at the bottom, which is where the scroll group was defined, right? So in that case, all I have to do is select that group of messages, and then over to the right in the properties inspector is I can set the padding to, let's say at the bottom, which is that third box, to maybe 32 pixels. And now if I play one more time, we have a nice amount of padding down at the bottom, which is great. So now if I, just to kind of really show you the power of stacks, if I did maybe duplicate another group here, it's going to push everything down. And if I dive in here and maybe let's say I add in the replies here, actually I can probably delete this. Maybe I'll add in the replies up here. Just like that. You're noticing as I'm making those changes, everything is adjusting really nicely. Right? I can delete that. Sorry, Christine. And it pushes it up. All right, the final thing we're going to do before we wrap things up is right down at the bottom, we may want an area where we can actually start typing a message. So for that, I am going to grab the good old rectangle one more time, draw one out. I still think this section here is a little bit too large, but that's okay. We'll run with it for now. Maybe I'll round out the corners just a little bit. Let's try 16 pixels. Just like that. And I might want a very subtle border just to separate it from the background, and possibly even a shadow. And I talk a lot about shadows quite a bit, but I want it nice and subtle. Maybe I'll add a little bit of color in there. I'll bump it down on the Y. Maybe I'll blur it quite a bit. Let's try 24. That looks okay. I think it could work. And if you're feeling a little bit adventurous, what you can also do is add a bit of a background blur. Now, by default, it's going to knock out that shadow. But if I blur it completely and then maybe increase the effect opacity, some of that shadow is going to come back into play. Now, especially on areas where you're going to have buttons and text and things like that, you want to keep your background blurs very, very subtle, right? And if you take a look, we have a little bit of blue in there from that image in the background, very subtle, right? But it gives an interesting effect. And then on here, we might want to just put something like type something. Let's bump this up, possibly. Yeah, a little bit. Maybe I'll bump this down to book. There we go. Move it on inwards a little bit. And then down here at the bottom, we're going to want some icons. You know, if you're familiar with Slack, there's a bold button, an italic button. There's all these different buttons so that you can set your type, right? So what we want to do is I'm going to grab the rectangle. I'm going to draw out, because this will also have some hover effects. That's pretty good for the size. I'm going to round out the corners ever so slightly. Let's try 4. And then drop the opacity. And then right on top, we might want, let's see if we have some bold. Oh, we do. Okay, this one looks pretty good. I'm going to paste that in there. Make that smaller. Let's change this to a nice dark gray. There we go. So we have this in place, right? But we don't want necessarily this to be displayed at all times. So we want a few different states. So that we're going to go ahead and turn this into a component over to the right, just like that. And the first state, default state, we don't want it seen at all. So I'm going to dive in here and simply drop the opacity to 0, right? Now, the second state is our hover state, so that when the mouse or the cursor hovers over top of it, that's going to display. So like I did before, let's bump it up to about 10%. Maybe I'll drop it a tiny bit more. Let's try 7%. Very subtle. And then we want one more state to what it looks like when it's actually pressed. So one more state, and this is going to be called, let's say, pressed. And maybe we will just bump this up even more. Now, as you increase this, you may have to experiment with, different type colors, right? White instead of black, but I think this could work. So we have our pressed hover state, or what we can do is maybe the hover state possibly has a bit of a border. I'm just experimenting. See how things look. A little bit of a border. Possibly. Maybe this is a little bit less, just like that. Very subtle, right? And then the pressed state is something like that. So if I press play, we can see, oops, I have to switch back to our default state. We have our hover, right? Just like that, but we don't have our press state set up just yet. So what we want to do is from the hover state, if we go into prototype mode, first of all, I'm going to set this to, just like we did with the hover effects over to the left, transition, because nothing's really going to be animating. And then from the hover state, we can add another interaction, which is going to be tap, and we're going to transition to our press state. No animation, and then from the press state, we can tap again to transition to our default state. Bold boop. Ooh, B for boop, that's right. So now if we zoom in here, so like you can see, we can hover, right? And then we can press to tap, or tap to switch to the press state. And we can tap again. There we go, right? And of course we can now use this. If I go ahead and group these two elements, I'm gonna call this one, let's say, I don't know, button for now. And then maybe I might want an italic. So I'm gonna just duplicate this over to the right. Let's find italic. Paste. Ooh, it's very large. Shrink it on down. Delete. There we go. Right, so we have bold, italic, and let's say underline possibly. And you can very easily make these particular icons without needing to use actual icons. But again, like I mentioned, I'm sometimes lazy and we are racing against time. There we go. Perfect. And then we'll do one more, which will be, let's say, strike through. Whoops, I missed it. There we go. Shrink it on down, pop it into place, delete, and there we go. So, like we did many times already, I'm going to make sure to select all of these, group them, and call these type options. Make sure that we have a stack enabled, and let's set this to, right now it's 21, let's try 24. So I can go in and just swap these around if I need to. But now I can also hover over any of these and I can press and make sure that they're all enabled just like that. When will you start a new XD challenge? I'm not sure. We have a lot of amazing hosts, and I have, not to give too much away, but I have a lot of videos to create for upcoming updates. And of course, Adobe Max is coming up in about 6 months, and we have a pretty large update as usual for that. So I have my hands full, but exciting things ahead. All right, so we have those, and of course we can add in additional things over here to the right. Things like lists and bullets and all that fun stuff, right? Let's actually add a few more. Why not? Duplicate. And this one might be list. Paste. View. Shrink it on down. And you're noticing because we have a stack enabled, it's also pushing the icons over to the left out of the way, which is nice. That one looks a little bit large, so I'm going to shrink it down a touch. And then finally, we can do one more. Also in between here, because the bold, italic, underline, strike through are kind of part of one group of options, we might want a little bit of a separator in the middle, right? So drag one in there. Maybe I'll reduce the opacity a little bit. And then let's go ahead, and what we can do is, because we have this line selected, is we can just adjust the padding directly from here. So maybe we can do is 18 and 18, right? When is video support coming? I cannot discuss upcoming features, but like some of the product managers have mentioned on Twitter, that's definitely something they're thinking about, but I cannot. It's obviously a very large project. When it comes to video, you have to think about things like file size and performance and playback and all these different things, right? But things that the team is definitely thinking about. So hang tight. You never know what the future holds. I do though, but I can't tell you. All right, we're gonna wrap this up. I'm gonna pop this one here and just make this a little bit smaller. And center. And there we go. And one more time, we can hover over any of these buttons. We get that little hover effect, and we can tap on them to activate. And there we go. So that is going to wrap it up for today's Adobe XD Masterclass. I will definitely be back next week with Masterclass number 52, an entire year of classes, which is great. Stick around. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few minutes. Big thank you to everyone who has tuned in, and I will see you all next time.